They made him kneel for doing the right thing, and by sunset, not a single man in that town would meet his eyes. The dust in Dry Creek always settled slow, like it had time to think before touching the ground. But that morning it hung in the air, thick and uncertain, stirred by boots that had gathered not for trade or talk, but for judgment. Ethan Cole felt it cling to his coat as he stood in the center of the street, the wooden boards beneath his feet warm from a rising sun that hadn't yet decided what kind of day it would be. Across from him stood a girl no older than 20, her dark hair falling in quiet strands over her shoulders, her hands bound not by rope, but by the way the crowd had already decided who she was. Ayanna Red Hawk didn't look at the people shouting. She didn't look at the sheriff, whose hat sat too low over his eyes. She looked only at the ground, as if the truth might be buried somewhere beneath the dirt they all stood on. She took it, someone said. They always do. The voices came one at a time at first, then together, like wind learning how to become a storm. Ethan had heard that tone before, not in words, but in the way men stopped thinking once they found someone to blame. He stepped forward anyway. Not fast, not loud, just enough for the boards to creak under his boots and for a few heads to turn. You see it happen? He asked. His voice wasn't sharp, but it carried. The kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to be heard. A man near the saloon spat into the dust. Don't need to. Look at her. Ethan glanced at Ayanna then, really looked this time. There was no fear in her face. No pleading. Just a stillness that didn't belong in a place like this. It unsettled him more than anger would have. That ain't proof, he said. The words landed heavier than he expected. A few men shifted. One laughed, but it didn't catch. Sheriff Walter Briggs cleared his throat, adjusting the badge on his vest like it might remind him who he was supposed to be. Ethan, he muttered, low enough to sound like advice, not warning. Don't make this harder than it is. Ethan didn't take his eyes off the girl. Seems to me it already is. Somewhere behind him, a door slammed. The sound echoed longer than it should have. The town was closing in, not with hands, but with distance. He could feel it. The space around him widening as people took half steps back, not wanting to stand too close to a man who had just crossed an invisible line. You choosing her? Someone called out. It wasn't a question. Not really. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows there's no turning back, even if he wanted to. I'm choosing right, he said. That was when it changed. Not all at once. No sudden movement. Just a shift, like the sun slipping behind a cloud. The eyes that had been fixed on Ayanna turned to him instead. And in them, something colder took shape. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Disapproval. Disappointment. The kind that builds into something worse if left alone too long. Ayanna lifted her head then, just slightly. For the first time, her eyes met his. They were darker than he expected, but steady. Not grateful. Not surprised. Just aware. Like she had seen this moment coming long before he stepped into it. He didn't nod. Didn't speak. But something passed between them anyway. Something that didn't need words to exist. The sheriff shifted again, glancing at the crowd, then back at Ethan. You're making a mistake, he said, louder now. Ethan tilted his head just enough to catch the light. Maybe, he replied. But it won't be the one you think. The wind picked up then, carrying the dust down the street, wrapping around boots and skirts and the edges of a town that had just drawn its line. And Ethan Cole, standing beside a girl no one else would stand for, felt the weight of every eye settle on him. Not as a neighbor, not as a rancher, but as something else entirely. Something the town hadn't decided how to deal with yet. Not a threat. Not quite. But no longer one of them. And in that silence, stretched thin between judgment and truth, the day began to lean towards something none of them were ready to face. By midday, the town had already decided what kind of man Ethan Cole was, and it was not the kind they poured whiskey for anymore. The heat settled heavy over Dry Creek, pressing down on rooftops, on shoulders, on thoughts that no one wanted to say out loud, but everyone seemed to share. Doors that once stayed open now closed a little quicker when he passed. Windows that used to greet him with a nod now held still faces that disappeared the moment he looked their way. Ethan walked slow down the main street, not because he was unsure, but because rushing would have meant he cared about where he was going. And right then, there was nowhere left in that town that felt like it belonged to him. Behind him, Ayanna followed at a distance of a few paces, not close enough to seem like she needed protection, not far enough to suggest she did not understand what standing beside him meant. She still had not spoken a single word. Not to the sheriff. Not to the crowd. Not even to him. And somehow, that silence weighed more than all the shouting from before. A man stepped out from the general store as Ethan approached, his arms crossed, his posture firm like a fence post set deep in the ground. "We are closed," he said, though the sign on the door still read open. Ethan glanced at the sign, then back at the man. "Looks open to me." The man shook his head once. "Not for you." It was said without anger. That was what made it land harder. No raised voice. No insult. Just a quiet decision, already made and not up for discussion. Ethan held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then gave a small nod like he had just confirmed something he already suspected. "Fair enough," he said, and kept walking. Ayana's eyes flickered briefly toward the store, then back to the ground. She did not react, not even a shift in her step. As if this kind of rejection was not new to her. As if she had learned long ago how to carry it without letting it show. The saloon doors creaked as Ethan pushed them open, the familiar scent of wood, smoke, and stale liquor wrapping around him like an old memory that no longer fit. Conversation stopped before he even reached the counter. Cards paused midair. Glasses hovered just short of lips. The piano in the corner missed a note, and did not recover. The bartender, a man who had known Ethan for years, set down the rag in his hand and stared at him like he was looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. "We do not want trouble," the bartender said quietly. Ethan rested his hands on the counter, the worn wood smooth under his palms. "I am not bringing any." The bartender hesitated, then glanced past Ethan toward the door, where Ayana stood just inside the threshold, not stepping further, not retreating either. A line drawn by instinct, not by law. "You already did," the bartender replied. Ethan let that sit between them. No argument. No defense. Just the truth as the town chose to see it. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a coin, and placed it on the counter with a soft, deliberate sound. "Just water," he said. The bartender looked at the coin, then at Ethan, then back at the coin again, like it might explain something if he stared long enough. Finally, he pushed it back across the counter. "Keep it," he said. "You might need it somewhere else." The words were not unkind. That was what made them final. Ethan picked up the coin, turned it once between his fingers, then slipped it back into his pocket without another word. He straightened, glanced once around the room at faces that refused to meet his, and turned toward the door. As he stepped outside, the sunlight felt sharper than before, like the day had lost whatever softness it started with. Ayana was waiting where he had left her. She looked at him now, directly, her expression unchanged, but there was something new in her eyes. Not gratitude, not relief, something closer to understanding. "You should not stay," she said finally, her voice low, steady, carrying the weight of someone who did not waste words. Ethan studied her for a moment. The way she stood, the way she held herself like the ground beneath her was the only thing she trusted. "Neither should you," he replied. A faint breeze moved through the street, lifting dust just enough to blur the edges of everything. Ayana shook her head slightly. "This is not my town," she said. Ethan gave a small, almost invisible nod. "It is not mine either," he answered. And for the first time since the morning began, the distance between them felt smaller. Not because the town had changed, but because neither of them belonged to it anymore. By late afternoon, the town no longer needed to say anything out loud, because silence had already done the work for them. It followed Ethan Cole like a shadow that did not belong to the sun, stretching across the street, slipping under doorways, settling into every corner where a man might once have found welcome. The hitching post outside the blacksmith shop stood empty where his horse had been tied that morning, the rope still looped but loose, swaying slightly, as if it remembered what had been taken without needing to explain how. Ethan paused there for a moment, his hand resting on the worn wood, feeling the grooves left by years of use, by men who had come and gone without ever thinking their place could be erased in a single day. He did not ask where the horse had gone. He already knew the answer would not come with words. Behind him, Ayana stepped closer than before, her boots quiet against the dirt, her presence no longer distant, but not quite beside him either. "They are testing you," she said, her voice even, as if she were describing the weather rather than the weight of a town turning its back. Ethan kept his eyes on the post. "Feels more like they already decided." Ayana tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might study a trail, not for where it begins, but for where it leads. Decisions can change, she said. Not when they are made together, he replied. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and something older, something that did not belong to the town at all. Ethan turned then, scanning the edges of the street, the rooftops, the spaces between buildings where movement might hide. Not fear, just awareness. The kind that comes from knowing when a line has been crossed and cannot be stepped back over the same way. You should leave before night, Iana said. They will not act in the open, but darkness makes men braver than they should be. Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, at the calm in her face, at the way she spoke about the town as if she had seen it before, somewhere else, under a different sky. You speak like you know. This place, he said. Iana's gaze drifted past him, toward the hills beyond the last row of buildings, where the land opened up and the town's rules began to lose their shape. It is always the same place, she answered softly. Only the names change. The words settled between them, heavier than they sounded. Ethan exhaled slowly, then pushed away from the post, his decision not spoken but already made. Come on, he said, nodding toward the far end of the street. There is still one place that might not care what the rest of them think. They walked together this time, not apart, not with space measured in steps, but side by side in a way that did not ask permission from the town watching them. Eyes followed. Doors remained closed. No one called out. That was the new rule. At the edge of Dry Creek, where the buildings thinned and the land began to breathe again, a small structure stood apart from the rest, weathered wood, a narrow porch, and a single chair that faced the horizon instead of the street. Ethan slowed as they approached, his steps quieter now, not from caution, but from memory. You trust this place? Iana asked. Ethan hesitated, just for a second. I trust the man who used to live here, he said. Do you know where he is now? She asked. Ethan's eyes rested on the empty chair, on the dust that had settled undisturbed across its seat. That depends on whether you believe a man can leave without going anywhere, he replied. Iana did not press further. She stepped onto the porch first, her weight light against the wood, as if she understood something about the place that Ethan had not yet put into words. He followed, the boards creaking under his boots, the sound familiar, grounding. Inside, the air was cooler, still, carrying the faint scent of herbs and old leather, of a life once lived without needing to be explained. Ethan moved toward the small table near the window, his eyes scanning the surface, the shelves, the corners where small things tended to gather meaning over time. That was when he saw it. A piece of fabric, folded carefully, resting beside a small tin cup. It was not new. The edges were worn, the color faded, but the pattern stitched into it was deliberate, intricate, not something made for decoration, but for purpose. Iana stepped closer, her breath almost catching, though she did not let it show fully. Her fingers hovered just above the cloth, not touching, not yet. Where did you get this? She asked quietly. Ethan frowned slightly, his mind turning over memories he had not visited in years. I did not get it, he said. It has been here longer than I have. Iana lowered her hand slowly, her eyes fixed on the pattern, on the story it carried without speaking. No, she said, barely above a whisper. It has not. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the walls, slipping through the cracks, as if the world itself was leaning in, waiting to see what would happen when a past no one remembered began to return. The fabric did not move, but something in the room shifted as if it had just been touched by more than hands. Ethan stood still, his eyes narrowing slightly, not from suspicion, but from recognition that had not yet found its way into words. Iana's gaze remained fixed on the cloth, her breathing steady but slower now, like she was measuring something deeper than what lay on the surface. You have seen this before, she said, not asking, not guessing, but stating it as a fact that had already settled. Ethan leaned one hand against the edge of the table, the wood cool beneath his palm, grounding him as memories stirred in places he had kept quiet for years. Maybe, he said, or maybe I have been trying not to. The light from the window shifted as a cloud passed overhead, dimming the room just enough to soften the edges of everything, including the past that was beginning to take shape. Iana finally lowered her hand and gently touched the fabric, her fingers tracing the pattern with a familiarity that did not belong to chance. This was not made for trade, she said. It was made for a promise. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes moving from the cloth to her face. What kind of promise? Ayanna did not look up. The kind that is given when someone owes a life, she answered. The words settled heavy in the air, filling the space between them with something neither of them could ignore anymore. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the open doorway, toward the fading light of the afternoon, as if the answer might be waiting out there instead of inside him. I never asked for anything in return, he said quietly. Ayanna's fingers paused on the fabric. That does not mean it was not given. Silence followed, but it was no longer empty. It carried weight now, shaped by something that had been set in motion long before this day began. Ethan straightened slowly, his shoulders easing back as if he had just accepted a burden he had forgotten he was carrying. There was a winter, he said after a moment, his voice low, steady, like he was speaking more to himself than to her. Years ago, snow came early, hard enough to bury trails, quiet enough to hide everything else. I found someone out there, barely conscious. Would have been gone by morning if I had kept writing. Ayanna lifted her eyes then, watching him closely, not interrupting, not guiding, just listening. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not with regret, but with the weight of memory returning piece by piece. I brought her here, he continued, gesturing faintly around the small cabin. Did what I could. Food, fire, time. That was all I had to give. He paused, his gaze distant now, fixed somewhere between the present and the past. She stayed 3 days. Never said much. Just watched. Like she was trying to understand something she could not see. Ayanna's expression softened, just barely, the smallest shift in a face that had learned to hold still. And when she left? She asked. Ethan glanced at the fabric again, then back at her. She left that, he said. Folded the same way. Did not explain it. Did not need to. Ayanna nodded slowly, her fingers still resting lightly on the cloth. Then you already know, she said. Ethan shook his head once. No, he replied. I know what happened. I do not know why it matters now. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, a low, steady sound that felt less like weather and more like time moving forward whether they were ready or not. Ayanna stepped back from the table, her posture straight, her eyes clear. Because the woman you helped, she said, her voice calm but certain, was my mother. The words did not echo, but they did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to, closing a distance that neither of them had understood until that moment. Ethan did not react right away. He stood there, still, letting the truth settle into place, not forcing it, not resisting it, just allowing it to exist. She spoke of a man who did not ask who she was, Ayanna continued. A man who did not see her as a threat, or a burden, or something to be feared. Ethan's eyes lowered slightly, not in shame, but in reflection. I just saw someone who needed help, he said. Ayanna held his gaze now, steady, unwavering. That is not something small, she replied. The room felt different now, not lighter, not heavier, but clearer, as if something that had been hidden in plain sight had finally been understood. Ethan exhaled slowly, then gave a small nod, more to himself than to her. Then I guess this is where it catches up, he said. Ayanna glanced toward the open door, toward the town in the distance, where judgment still waited, unchanged, unmoved. No, she said quietly. This is where it begins to change. And for the first time since the morning, Ethan did not feel like the ground beneath him was shifting. He felt like he was finally standing in the right place, even if it meant standing alone. The wind did not stop when the truth was spoken, but it seemed to carry it farther than either of them could see. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the fabric still folded in his hand now, lighter than it should have been for something that carried so much weight. The sun had begun its slow descent, stretching shadows across the dry ground, turning the edges of the world softer, less certain. Ayanna followed, stopping just behind him, her presence quiet but no longer distant. The town of Dry Creek sat out there beyond the rise, unchanged in shape, unchanged in belief, but something in Ethan's gaze toward it had shifted. Not anger, not defiance, something steadier. They will not listen, Ayanna said after a moment, her voice calm, not dismissive, just honest in a way that did not try to comfort. Ethan rolled the fabric once between his fingers, feeling the stitching, the intention behind every thread. They do not have to, he replied. They just have to see. Ayanna studied him, not questioning the words, but weighing the man. Who spoke them? Seeing is harder, she said. Ethan gave a faint nod. That is why most folks avoid it. The two of them stood in silence for a while, the kind that did not need filling. Then Ethan stepped down from the porch, his boots pressing into the dirt with purpose now, not hesitation. He did not look back at the cabin. Whatever it had held, it had already given what it needed to. Ayanna moved beside him as they started back toward town, their pace steady, not rushed, not cautious, just deliberate. Halfway down the path, the sound reached them first. Not voices. Not yet. Hoofbeats. Slow. Measured. More than one. Ethan stopped, his head tilting slightly as he listened, not for danger, but for intention. Ayanna's eyes narrowed just a fraction, her attention shifting toward the ridge where the land curved upward before dropping into the road that led into Dry Creek. They come before night, she said. They do not want darkness for this. Ethan's jaw set, but not from fear. No, he said quietly. They want it seen. The riders appeared over the rise a moment later, not in a rush, not spread wide, but in a line that held its shape as it moved. Sheriff Walter Briggs rode at the front, his posture straighter than before, his hat pulled low, not to hide, but to hold himself together. Behind him, a handful of townsmen followed, men who had stood in the square that morning, men who had chosen a side without needing to say it twice. They slowed as they approached, the distance closing not with urgency, but with inevitability. Ethan did not move. Ayanna did not step back. The wind slipped between them, carrying dust that settled quickly, as if even it did not want to linger too long in what was about to unfold. Briggs brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet away, the others fanning out just enough to form a line without meaning to. He looked at Ethan first, then at Ayanna, then at the fabric in Ethan's hand. His eyes lingered there for half a second longer than anything else. You left town, Briggs said, his voice even, controlled. Ethan nodded once. Seemed like the right place to think. Briggs glanced at the others behind him, then back again. And did you? Ethan held up the fabric. Slightly, not as a threat, not as proof, just as something that existed whether they acknowledged it or not. Enough, he said. A murmur moved through the men behind the sheriff, quiet, uncertain, like a thought trying to find its way into words, but not quite ready. Briggs shifted in his saddle, his gaze returning to Ayanna. You still have not said a word to defend yourself, he said. Ayanna met his eyes without hesitation. You already decided what my words mean, she replied. The sheriff did not answer right away. Something in his expression tightened, not anger, but the strain of holding on to something that no longer fit as easily as it had that morning. Ethan took a small step forward, just enough to shift the weight of the moment. You asked for proof, he said. This is as close as you are going to get. Briggs looked at the fabric again, his eyes tracing the pattern without understanding it, but sensing that it mattered more than he could explain. It is a piece of cloth, one of the men behind him said, his voice sharper than the rest. Ethan did not look at him. It is a promise, he said. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but firm, like something that did not need agreement to be true. Ayanna stepped forward then, not ahead of Ethan, not behind him, but beside him, her voice steady as the ground beneath their feet. And promises are not made without reason, she added. The line of men did not move, but something in their stance shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like the first crack in something that had seemed solid just moments before. The sun dipped lower, the light stretching longer, and for the first time since they rode out, Sheriff Briggs did not look certain of where he stood. And in that uncertainty, something began to loosen, not in the town, not yet, but in the space where truth had finally been given a place to stand. No one reached for a weapon, and that was what made the moment heavier than anything else. The line between them held, thin as wire, stretched by pride, by fear, by something none of them wanted to name out loud. Sheriff Briggs shifted slightly in his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight, his eyes moving once more between Ethan, Ayanna, and the fabric that seemed to carry more authority than any badge he wore. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that blurred the edges of every man standing there, as if the land itself was refusing to draw clear lines anymore. A promise, Briggs repeated slowly, like he was testing the shape of the word, trying to decide if it belonged in his world. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the silence do what it needed to do, let it stretch just long enough for the others to feel it, not as absence, but as pressure. "You ever keep one, Sheriff?" Ethan asked finally, his voice even, not accusing, not soft, just steady. Briggs' jaw tightened slightly. "That depends," he said, "on who it was made to." Ethan nodded once. "That is where you are wrong," he replied. "It depends on who you are when it is time to keep it." A murmur moved again through the men behind Briggs, but it was different this time. Not agreement. Not yet. But something unsettled. Something that did not sit as comfortably as it had before. One of the riders shifted his reins, glancing toward the others, then back toward Ethan, like he was waiting for someone else to decide what this meant. Ayanna remained still beside Ethan, her presence no longer something they could dismiss as separate from him. The two of them stood as one line now, not drawn by choice, but by truth that had already bound them before any of this began. "You are asking this town to take your word over theirs," one man said, his voice sharper, trying to regain ground that had started to slip. Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him without giving him more weight than necessary. "No," he said. "I am asking you to look at what you already chose not to see." The man opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped. Not because he had nothing to say, but because whatever he had did not feel as certain as it had that morning. Briggs exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but deliberate, like a man realizing that holding onto something too tightly might be the very thing that breaks it. He swung one leg over his saddle and stepped down onto the ground, the dust rising softly around his boots. It was a small movement, but it shifted everything. No longer above them, no longer removed. Now standing in the same space, under the same weight. He took a few steps forward, closing the distance to about 10 feet, his eyes fixed on the fabric in Ethan's hand. "Let me see it," he said. Ethan did not hesitate. He stepped forward just enough and extended the cloth, not offering it like a surrender, but placing it between them like a question that had already been answered somewhere else. Briggs took it carefully, his fingers rough against the worn edges, his eyes tracing the pattern again, slower this time, not trying to understand it fully, but trying to respect that he could not. "I have seen markings like this before," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. Ayanna stepped forward half a pace. "Then you know it is not made lightly," she said. Briggs nodded once, almost reluctantly. "No," he admitted. The men behind him shifted again, their formation loosening without anyone giving the order. One stepped his horse back slightly. Another lowered his gaze. Small things, but they added up. Ethan watched it all without moving, without pushing, letting it happen in its own time, because forcing it now would only turn it back into something it had been before. Briggs looked up from the fabric, his eyes meeting Ethan's, and for the first time, there was no authority in them. Only the weight of a choice that could not be undone once made. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then we judged too quickly." Ethan did not nod, did not smile. "You did not judge," he replied. "You decided." The words did not strike. They settled. And in that settling, something shifted deeper than any argument could reach. Briggs looked back at the men behind him, at the town that stood beyond them, unseen but present in every thought, every hesitation. Then he handed the fabric back to Ethan, his grip loosening as if returning something that had never belonged to him in the first place. "Then it is time we decide again," he said. No one spoke after that. Not because they agreed, not because they understood, but because something had broken in the space where certainty used to live, and none of them knew yet what would take its place. The sun slipped lower, the light fading, into something softer, and for the first time since morning, the town of Dry Creek was no longer sure of itself. And in that uncertainty, quiet and fragile, the beginning of something else took hold. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the men like dust that refused to be shaken off. And for the first time that day, no one seemed eager to be the one who spoke first. Sheriff Briggs remained where he stood, his shoulders no longer squared with certainty, but held in place by something heavier, something that had replaced the ease of judgment with the burden of reconsideration. Ethan did not move. Ayanna did not lower her gaze. The distance between them and the others remained the same, but it no longer felt like a line drawn in opposition. It felt like a space waiting to be crossed, if anyone was willing. One of the riders shifted again, this time stepping his horse back a full pace, the movement small but impossible to ignore. Another followed, not out of agreement, but out of discomfort, like men who suddenly realized they had been standing too close to something they did not understand. You said she took something. Ethan spoke at last, his voice calm, not pressing, but guiding. What was it? The question hung there, simple, direct, and for a moment, no one answered. Then the same man who had spoken before cleared his throat, his voice less certain now. A silver clasp, he said. From the store? It went missing this morning. Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes shifting toward Briggs. Did anyone see her take it? Briggs hesitated, just long enough to answer the question without words. No, he admitted. Ethan's gaze moved slowly across the men, not accusing, not challenging, just asking them to stand in what they had already said. So you filled in the rest, he said. No one argued. Ayanna stepped forward then, her movement quiet, but it drew every eye back to her, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to attention. She reached into the small fold of her garment and brought out something wrapped in a thin strip of cloth, carefully, deliberately, as if what she held was not just an object, but something that carried meaning beyond its shape. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a small silver clasp, worn at the edges, but intact, its surface catching the last light of the day. A murmur rippled through the men again, sharper this time, but not with accusation. With confusion. Ayanna held it out, not to Ethan, not to Briggs, but to the space between them. This was given to me, she said. Not taken. Briggs stepped forward, his boots pressing into the dirt, his hand extending cautiously as if he were reaching for something that might disappear if handled too roughly. He took the clasp, turning it in his fingers, examining it not as evidence, but as something that demanded explanation. Who gave it to you? He asked. Ayanna's eyes did not waver. The man who owns the store, she said. The words landed heavier than any accusation had that morning. All eyes shifted, not to Ethan, not to Ayanna, but back toward the town behind them, toward the place where the story had begun without truth. The man who had first spoken stiffened slightly, his posture tightening as if he had just realized the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as he believed. That is not what he said, someone muttered. Ethan did not raise his voice. Did anyone ask him twice? He said. The question settled into the silence, and this time, it stayed there. Briggs looked down at the clasp again, then back at Ayanna, then at the men behind him. The weight of it all pressed into his expression, not as confusion, but as clarity that had come too late to feel comfortable. We will ask him, Briggs said finally, though the words sounded less like a command and more like an obligation he could not avoid. Ethan gave a small nod, not in approval, but in acknowledgement that the direction had changed. Ayanna stepped back beside him, her hands empty now, her role no longer that of the accused, but not yet something else either. The men began to shift again, this time not away from Ethan, but away from the certainty they had carried into this moment. One turned his horse slightly toward town. Another lowered his head, his grip on the reins loosening. No one spoke of guilt. No one spoke of apology. But something had already been undone. Briggs turned back toward Ethan, his voice quieter now. You could have walked away, he said. Ethan looked at him, his expression unchanged. So could you, he replied. The sheriff held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, not as agreement, but as acceptance of something he had not chosen earlier in the day. The sun dipped lower still, the light thinning into something softer, and the long shadows stretched across the ground, blending together until it was harder to tell where one man ended and another began. And in that fading light, the truth did not arrive like a storm. It arrived the way it always does, quiet, patient, and impossible to ignore once it is seen. They did not ride back to town with the same shape they had come with, and that was the first thing that could not be undone. The line had broken without a command, without a signal, just men turning their horses one by one, not in defiance, not in unity, but in quiet retreat from something they no longer wished to stand inside. Sheriff Briggs mounted slowly, his movements measured, as if he understood that whatever came next would not be decided from the saddle. He glanced once more at Ethan, then at Ayanna, his expression stripped of the certainty that had carried him out here. We will settle it in town, he said, though the words sounded less like authority and more like a man choosing a place to finish what had already begun. Ethan gave a small nod, not agreeing, not resisting, just acknowledging that the road only moved one way now. Iona said nothing. She did not need to. The truth had already been placed between them, and it did not require her to carry it any further. They followed at a distance, not as prisoners, not as guests, but as something in between, something the town had not yet decided how to name. The sun hovered low, painting the edges of buildings in long amber lines as they entered Dry Creek again, but the town did not greet them the way it had that morning. There was no shouting, no crowd waiting to be fed another certainty. Doors remained closed, but not with the same firmness. Windows watched, but did not hide as quickly. It was not welcome, but it was not rejection either. It was something quieter, something unsettled. Briggs dismounted in front of the general store, his boots hitting the ground with a sound that carried farther than it should. Have. He did not call out. He did not draw attention. He simply walked to the door and pushed it open, stepping inside without waiting to see who followed. The others gathered slowly behind him, not crowding, not pressing, just present. Ethan stopped a few feet from the entrance, his eyes scanning the street, not for danger, but for change. Iona stood beside him, her posture still, her gaze steady, her silence now something different. Not absence, but control. Inside, voices rose briefly, not in anger, but in surprise, then quieted just as quickly. The store owner, a narrow man with quick eyes and a voice that usually filled a room before anyone else could, now stood behind his counter with both hands resting flat against the wood, as if holding himself in place. "Sheriff," he said, his tone careful. Briggs did not remove his hat. "You gave her something this morning," he said, placing the silver clasp on the counter between them. It was not a question. The man's eyes flickered to the object, then to the faces behind Briggs, then to the open doorway where Ethan and Iona stood framed in the fading light. He hesitated, just long enough for the room to feel it. "I sell things," he replied. Briggs did not move. "That is not what I asked." The silence stretched again, thinner now, sharper, like something about to give. The man swallowed once, his fingers pressing harder into the wood. "She asked for water," he said finally. "She had nothing to trade." His voice dropped slightly. "So I gave her the clasp. Told her to come back, when she could pay." The words settled into the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that left no space for interpretation. No one spoke. No one needed to. Outside, the street remained still, as if the entire town was holding its breath without realizing it. Briggs picked up the clasp, turning it once more in his hand, then placed it back down, this time with less weight, as if it had already done what it came to do. He nodded once, not to the man, not to anyone in particular, but to the truth itself. Then he turned and walked out. The men followed, slower now, quieter, each step carrying less certainty than the last. Ethan did not step forward. He did not meet them. Halfway, he simply stood where he was, waiting, not for an apology, not for acknowledgement, but for the moment to pass fully into what it had become. Briggs stopped a few feet in front of him, his hat still low, his eyes no longer avoiding, but no longer commanding either. He did not speak. Instead, he reached up, removed the badge from his vest, and held it in his hand for a moment, as if weighing something that could not be measured. Then, without a word, he slid it back into place, not as a symbol of authority, but as something he would have to carry differently from now on. He gave Ethan a single nod. Not gratitude, not regret, just recognition. Then he turned and walked away. One by one, the others followed, not looking back, not needing to. The street did not fill with noise. No one stepped forward to explain. No one rushed to correct what had been done. They simply returned to their places, quieter than before, changed in ways they would not speak about. Iona watched them go, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softer now, not from relief, but from understanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders not all at once, but enough to feel the difference. He looked at her then, not as someone he had defended, but as someone who had brought something back into the light that the town had forgotten how to see. And in the space they stood, empty now but no longer divided, the day did not end with victory. It ended with silence. The kind that does not erase what happened, but makes sure it will not be forgotten. The town did not return to normal the next morning, because something had shifted too deep for that kind of repair. The sun rose the same way it always did over Dry Creek, stretching pale light across rooftops and hitching posts, warming the dust that never really left, but the air carried a quiet that did not belong to habit. It belonged to memory. Ethan Cole stood outside the same general store, not stepping in, not expecting anything, just watching as the town moved around him in slower, more careful ways. A man who once would have tipped his hat now paused before doing it, then gave a small nod instead, as if unsure what gesture fit the moment. Another walked past without looking away too quickly, his eyes lingering just a second longer than comfort allowed. No one spoke of the day before. No one mentioned the clasp, or the accusation, or the way certainty had unraveled without a single raised voice. But it was there, in every step, in every glance that did not quite meet or fully turn away. Ayanna stood near the edge of the street, where the buildings gave way to open land, her posture unchanged, her presence as steady as it had been from the moment she arrived. She had not asked to stay. She had not said she would leave. She simply existed in the space, no longer pushed out of it, but not fully welcomed either. And somehow that was enough. Ethan walked toward her, his boots quiet against the dirt, the rhythm of his steps no longer measured by the town's approval, but by something internal, something settled. "They will not forget," he said, stopping beside her, his gaze following hers toward the horizon. Ayanna did not look at him. "They will remember what is comfortable first," she replied. "The rest will take time." Ethan nodded once, understanding without needing more. The wind moved lightly across the open land, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, a reminder that the world stretched far beyond the limits of Dry Creek and the decisions made within it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ayanna reached into the fold of her garment again, her hand moving with the same quiet intention it had the day before. She pulled out a small object, wrapped in a strip of worn leather, and held it for a second before offering it to Ethan. He looked at it, then at her, not reaching immediately. "You already gave me something," he said. Ayanna shook her head slightly. "That was my mother's," she said. "This is mine." Ethan took it then, slowly, unwrapping the leather to reveal a small pendant, simple in shape, but marked with the same pattern as the fabric, the same careful stitching translated into metal. It was not polished. It was not meant to shine. It was meant to last. He turned it once in his hand, feeling its weight, lighter than it should have been, heavier than it looked. "What does it mean?" he asked. Ayanna's eyes met his then, steady, clear. "It means you are not alone in what you chose," she said. The words settled into him, not as a reward, not as a comfort, but as a truth that did not need to be explained further. Ethan closed his hand around the pendant, nodding once, not out of gratitude, but out of understanding. "And you?" he asked. "Where will you go?" Ayanna looked back toward the open land, toward the hills that held no fences, no streets, no judgments waiting to be made. "Where I am needed," she said simply. Ethan gave a faint smile, the kind that did not show much, but meant more than it revealed. "That sounds like a long road," he said. Ayanna returned the smallest hint of one. "It always is." They stood there a moment longer, not saying goodbye, not marking the moment with anything that might make it smaller than it was. Then Ayanna turned and began to walk, her steps steady, her figure moving away from the town without hesitation, without looking back. Ethan watched until she reached the edge of sight, until the land itself seemed to take her in, the way it always had for people who belonged to it. Only then did he turn back toward Dry Creek. The town had not changed overnight. It might never fully change, but something had been seen. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Ethan slipped the pendant into his pocket and walked down the street, not as a man returning to what he had before, but as someone carrying something different, something quieter, something that did not need the town's approval to exist. A door opened somewhere behind him. A voice called out to another. Life moved forward, the way it always does, but with a weight that lingered just beneath the surface. And in that quiet weight, in that space where no one said what they had learned, the truth remained, steady and patient, waiting for the next moment someone would choose to see it again.